Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this 22nd day of July 2014. You are listening to Slobodny vysielac, the free broadcaster from Banská Bystrica, the heart of Slovakia, consequently the heart of Europe. Like our predecessors in 1944 and in 1968, we are the only radio station in Slovakia to oppose foreign oppression on our nation. We do not claim that the only truth in the universe can be heard here. We are here to let politicians, analysts, experts, and ordinary people say their views and opinions on current political and social situation. The job of finding the truth has been and always will be yours. Tonight we will be talking about the killing of 298 people on Malaysian Airlines MH17 over Ukraine and the killing of over 500 people in Gaza. My name is Norbert Lichtner, and our first guest tonight is Dr. Paul Craig Robertsom, former Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Economic Policy for the Reagan administration and Associate Editor of the Wall Street Journal. He was columnist for Business Week, Skip Howard News Service, and Creators Syndicate. Good evening, Dr. Roberts. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us on tonight's show.
Thank you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, we were talking a few months ago, and your analysis and forecast for the situation in Ukraine was, for some people, quite dark and pessimistic. Some even said that you went over the board. I got some emails from our listeners. Now, the time has passed, and we know that, unfortunately, we were spot on. And frankly, I was expecting a lot of things, but shooting down a foreign airliner did not cross my mind. What is your take on the situation? What's happening, in your opinion?
Well, if we are limiting the discussion to the airliner...
No, of course not. You go ahead. If you want to go wider...
let's begin with that.
Yeah.
Let's begin with that, then we can go wider. With the airliner, one thing we know for certain, and that is that Washington is using the incident without any evidence to demonize Russia and to demonize the president of Russia. As soon as the news was out that the airliner had gone down, Washington was ready with its explanation that Russia was responsible.
Now, were they ready or were they fast?
Yes, they were all ready. Everything was on cue. And so was the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. I was actually listening to American National Public Radio at the time. I was driving, and on came the BBC program. It was the most scripted news program I have ever listened to. It was all set up, and clearly Russia was the cause. And this has been the story ever since, despite the fact there's no evidence whatsoever to support the accusations and the insinuations.
Excuse me, I would like just to ask you about the media. I was in Rome when it happened, and I don't watch this British brainwashing corporation, but I was forced to, in my hotel room, to watch CNN. And usually I give CNN, 7 seconds when you are flipping over the channel, so you see the talking heads and you just go on. But what was happening on CNN, it was literally warmongering. But legally, if you listen to them very carefully, legally you couldn't catch them. Yeah, they used the right words, and it was really scripted. Was the BBC like that, or was the BBC saying it outright that the Russians are in fault?
The BBC was using correspondents and other people to say it.
Okay.
So, in generally speaking, the point of Russian guilt is made by insinuation rather than outright accusation. Now, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, has made outright accusations, and others have. But usually it's insinuated that the Russians are responsible. And if they repeat these insinuations over and over and over, they become true. But there has never been any reference to any evidence, except evidence that has proved to be concocted or invalid. So that's one thing we know. Washington was delighted with this incident because it could be used to demonize Russia. And Washington hopes to use this incident to break off the relationships Europe has with Russia, to break off the economic and political relationships. Washington is very disturbed at the strength of the economic and political relationships that are growing between Europe and Russia. And Washington was very upset when the European Union recently refused to go along with Washington's unilateral sanctions against Russia. So Washington wants to use this airline incident to demonize Russia and to use that pressure on Europe to break off their profitable economic relationships. So we know that what I've just told you is a fact. Now, the next question is, who did it? It possibly was an accident, or possibly it was arranged by the CIA and the extreme right-wing Ukrainian nationalists for the purpose of demonizing Russia. We don't know that yet, and that may not be the case, but this is a possibility. There is also a possibility that the CIA and the Ukrainian ultranationalists, who really are operating partly in the government in Ukraine and partly outside the government, it's possible that there was a plot to assassinate Putin, because there have been reports from air traffic control that his airliner, at least in some initial stages, was on the same path as the Malaysian airliner that was blown out of the sky. So it could be that it was a plot to get Putin, and it went wrong, and they got the wrong plane. Now, what do we know? We do know, because the Russians have released their satellite photographs that show that Ukrainian missile batteries were deployed in the area where the plane went down, and that these batteries were under the control of the Ukrainian military. So we have these photos from the satellite that show this. And so when the Ukrainian government says, oh, we didn't have any missile batteries in the area, clearly not telling the truth, or else they were not informed, because the photographs show they're there. What else do we know for a fact? The Russian government has released the flight pattern of the Ukrainian jet, the fighter jet or the fighter bomber, that went up and to encounter the airliner. Now, what was it doing? Why was it there? Was it trying to find out what kind of plane it was because they didn't want to hit the wrong plane? It's very unusual to see a fighter jet approach a commercial airliner that is on a path dictated by the air control of that country. So we do know that happened. What else do we know? We know for a fact that the United States had a satellite over the area at the precise moment that the plane was knocked down. And so this means Washington has photographs of everything that happened.
But they haven't released it yet.
But they will not release them. The president of Russia has asked them to please release the photographs, please show us the evidence. We've shown you what evidence we have. What evidence do you have? Silence. Now, what happened yesterday or today, I forget which, there's an American journalist named Robert Perry.
Oh, you must know him really well.
I don't know him well. He was an enemy when I was.
I know. That's why I'm saying it.
But I don't care. I mean, people make mistakes. Perry is no longer part of the establishment media. They kicked him out because he says things they don't like. But he, at one time, was a very important member of the American media establishment. I think he was at the New York Times.
And anyway, Associated Press, Newsweek,
Yeah, so he was an important person who has been kicked out because he won't lie enough. Well, what Perry wrote, he said, look, I've just had a whistleblower inside the Central Intelligence Agency who has told me that the CIA has concluded from the satellite photographs of the American satellite that it was a Ukrainian missile battery that brought down the airliner. Now, of course, the whistleblower can't dare reveal who he is because he will suffer the same fate of Edward Snowden, of Julian Assange, of Bradley Manning. And so we can't know, and Robert Perry said we can't know whether this report is true. But I suspect it is true because otherwise Washington would have released the photos. If the photos supported Washington's position, they would have been instantly released. There would have been a huge press conference, probably even at the UN. And they would have shown the photos and shown who did it and where the missile is and so on. Instead, there's silence. And there's been no response from Washington to the Russian president's request that they make the evidence available to the world so that this incident can be brought to a conclusion.
I'd like to ask you, what do you think? Why Malaysian airline? I used to fly with them quite a lot. It's a very good airline, and
I have no idea.
But about half a year ago, another got missing.
Well, look, it would be much more difficult. Look, we don't know what happened, but if it was a plot to embarrass Russia, it would be much more serious if it was a German airline or a British airline or a French airliner, because these are countries that are part of Americans' empire in Europe. And the Washington doesn't want to lose these countries. But Malaysia, it's not who protects Malaysia? No one. It's a small country over in Asia. It's not protected by India. It's not protected by China. It's not protected by Russia. It's been on the outs with the United States. And so it's an easy target. Malaysia is relatively powerless. It hasn't any influence. It hasn't a strong voice. There are not going to be demands from Malaysia comparable to, say, Germany. If it was a German airline, you would hear lots of demands for explanations. These demands would be embarrassing to the United States. So that is one explanation. Another explanation we've already mentioned. Possibly the Ukrainians had a plot, not necessarily the government, but these right-wing elements that seem now to be an operating arm of the CIA. They may have had a plot, and they were going to assassinate Putin because Putin is in Washington's way. And they may have confused this plane with Putin's airliner. Now, the Russian government has said that Putin's airliner was not on that course. And that's probably the case. But it was at an earlier time of the day. Both airlines were on the same course. And so this may have been projected ahead by the CIA, and the Ukrainian militias operating under the right sector may have thought this was Putin's plane. It may have been the reason the fighter jet was sent up to investigate. Perhaps he made a mistake, or perhaps the people on the ground made a mistake. We don't know. It's all speculation. I think that since the separatists have turned over the transponders to the Malaysians, that if the Malaysians can keep them in their control and the international body can examine the evidence, we will find out what happened. Clearly, the Russians and the separatists are not afraid of the evidence, because the separatists turned over the evidence, and the Russians keep calling for an objective international examination by experts, a non-politicized examination. So if they had something to fear, they wouldn't be making those calls. What does Washington do? Nothing. It issues insinuations, accusations. There's no call for evidence.
Yep.
There's a call for Russia to admit you did it.
The main question is cui bono,
Yeah.
Well,
clearly the Russians don't benefit,
No.
The separatists don't benefit, but Washington benefits. Now, Washington intends to benefit whether it's responsible or not, because it gets the same use out of the incident, whether this was a CIA plot or whether it was an accident. Because regardless, they're going to blame Russia.
Now, if we continue with going wider, what did you have in your mind?
Well, I think that what's important for the Russian people and the government to understand, and also for people and governments in Eastern and Central Europe, and of course Western Europe, they need to understand that the foreign policy of the United States is based on the Wolfowitz doctrine. This is Paul Wolfowitz, a notorious neoconservative, an ally of Israel, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he wrote the doctrine that governs United States military and foreign policy. And that doctrine, which I have quoted several times in my columns, states explicitly that it is imperative on the United States to prevent the rise of any other power, specifically Russia. And of course, it applies equally to China. So the United States is committed to preventing the rise of Russia and China. Well, how can they do that? They're putting military bases around both countries, but that doesn't really do it. They can do it by demonizing the countries and by trying to break off their economic and political associations with other countries. So that is the overall governing strategy of the United States, is to isolate Russia. And as I said earlier, the United States is very disturbed at the growing economic and political connections between Russia and Europe, specifically Germany and France. And so that then puts all of this in context. If it's an accident, if the Malaysian airliner coming down is an accident, it still serves Washington's purpose because they have blamed Russia. They're demonizing Russia. You see, English is a world language. Russian isn't. So Washington can put the story out everywhere. Washington can control the explanation. And as we have discussed earlier, the United States no longer has an independent media. That ceased in the final years of the Clinton regime, when President Clinton permitted 5 mega corporations to buy up the media and concentrate it in a few hands. And these corporations are dependent on their federal broadcast licenses, so they cannot go against the government. So this allows Washington to control the explanation regardless of the facts, regardless of the truth. Now, remember, Norbert, Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction.
Yes, I do.
Well, we know for a fact that the weapons inspectors on the ground in Iraq, it was headed up by Hans Blick, the weapons inspectors reported over and over, there are no weapons here. Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction. But Washington didn't want to hear that. And so they ignored the evidence and concocted evidence and sent the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, to the United Nations to lie to the world. Now, we all know this now. A lot of people didn't know it at the time, but we know it now. What else did Washington do? Washington concocted evidence that Assad in Syria had used chemical weapons against his own people. We know now this was a lie. But Washington intended to use this lie in order to attack Syria. It failed for 2 reasons. The Russians blocked it, and the British Parliament blocked it, because Washington had no evidence to give to the Prime Minister Cameron to present to the Parliament. And the Parliament said, we don't believe you. No evidence, no war. So that blocked the American effort to attack Syria. We saw the same lies with Libya, the same deceptions on the part of Washington. And so if you are going to achieve your agenda at all costs, regardless of the lies and deceptions, even if you're going to send one of the highest officials in the government to lie to the United Nations in front of the whole world, the cameras, clearly you will ignore whatever evidence comes out of the Ukraine.
What about the general public? Because all these lies, they have been, lots of them. And, over the time, we always, found out that there were lies. But the general public always tends to believe the new ones.
Yes.
Why?
Well, first of all, the American people being essentially isolated, there are 2 huge oceans on each side. There's Canada to the north, which they think of as the United States. And there's Mexico to the south, which they think of as illegal immigrants. And they don't have any interaction with other peoples. They don't know other languages. They are content with themselves. So they don't know anything about the world or history or events. And they're not particularly interested because it doesn't directly impinge on them. They're not like Czechoslovakia, that's close to Russia and could be caught up in a difficult situation if the United States forces Europe into a conflict with Russia.
Oh, we border Ukraine. Yeah.
That's right. You're on the border of Ukraine, which once was Russia. Now, so they haven't the interest, and they aren't particularly interested in the news unless it directly affects them, and they rely on television. They're rushing off to work. They have it on for 15 minutes. They listen to all the lies that come off of Fox News, CNN, whatever. A few of them read newspapers. The same lies are there. They don't have any information, and they're not motivated to go find information. They don't know enough about the internet. They probably use the internet primarily for pornography or for sending emails, and they don't know of the extensive internet journalism. They wouldn't know what to trust, what not to trust. So they haven't any information. And Americans think that being patriotic means you believe the government. If you don't believe the government, you must be an anti-American.
That sounds sad. That's really sad. Yeah.
You see, my generation was taught that you believe the Constitution, you defend the Constitution, not the government.
Yeah.
That the United States is the Constitution and that the government is an enemy of the Constitution, that you have to constantly watch or it will subvert the Constitution and take away your civil liberties. That's the way my generation was brought up, but not today.
But your Constitution these days, well, for the last maybe 10, 15 years, is getting a really savage beating from these people.
It no longer exists.
You think so?
All of the protections in the Constitution, protections of the people, have been removed by the George W. Bush and the Obama regimes. They're no longer there. They don't exist. We all exist now simply because the government hasn't come to get us yet.
Well,
you see, the Constitution gave the people, it was a shield that protected people from the government. So the Constitution made law a protector of the people. But today, the government has turned law into a weapon that it uses against people.
Do you think that the people, the Americans, let this happen because the government put, the God's fear into them, terrorists and boogeymen and all this stuff?
Terrorism was an important part of it. Of course, 9/11 was the beginning, and the government has used that to convince people that having civil liberties is dangerous because terrorists could take advantage and you could be killed. And so if you just let us take away your civil liberties, we will protect you with a police state. The terrorists won't be able to get through the police state to get you. But of course, the police state can get you.
Yeah, that's the question. Who are the terrorists? That's the biggest question these days.
They're all in Washington, and of course Israel. Washington, Israel. These are the two terrorist countries.
Before we move to Israel, I've got a couple of questions here from the listeners. Daniel is asking. I would like to ask Dr. Roberts if he thinks that the Russians know what's going on. I mean, if they know that. Same thing we know that the Western political elites want to destabilize Russia and make the relationship with EU, a bad relationship.
I don't think all of them know.
Well, the government will.
If you look at Putin, you assume he has to know.
Yeah.
But he keeps relying on Western goodwill. He keeps saying, look, I just want to get this resolved. Talk to us. Let's work this out. And the response he gets is, you did it, you did it, you did it. So he keeps relying on goodwill, even though the West has no goodwill toward him. So does he know it or doesn't he know it? Well, he must know it by now. I do know that a lot of the younger Russian professionals, they're brainwashed by Americans. They were very much influenced by the Cold War propaganda. And of course, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union could be abusive. And they know about that, but they don't know about how abusive the United States can be. And they think that the United States, they have freedom and liberty and free press and civil rights and blah, 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 but we don't. There's no such thing. But they believed that because that was the success of American Cold War propaganda, and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union discredited itself. So you have many of these Russians. These are the Russians that the United States has the most influence on. The United States pours in billions of dollars into Russia, into what are called non-governmental organizations. And they pull off stunts like Pussy Riot.
Yeah.
They pull off stunts like the protest against Putin's election. You may remember when Putin was elected, all the protesters were in the streets saying he stole the election, he stole the election. Well, of course he didn't. He won it overwhelmingly. But these are Russians who are organized by Washington and serve Washington's purpose. Now, I think the number of these Russians are declining because of this crisis. They can see that Putin is being reasonable, that he's not provocative, and they can see that the charges against Russia and against Putin are unreasonable. There's no evidence. They're just accusations, no evidence. And so I think in this sense, the United States is working against itself because it's convincing many of the members of the American-financed non-governmental organizations that they've been duped by Washington. And because if you look at Putin's poll ratings, they are way up. They're far higher than any Western leader. In fact, higher, I think, than any Western leader has ever had. So the Russians now are uniting around Putin. I think on the whole, though, the main problem the Russians have is they want to be part of the West. They want to be accepted by the West. And this desire, I think, makes them somewhat blind, somewhat gullible to the fact that the West, or not that I can't say the West, but Washington is determined to isolate Russia and prevent its rise as a power. And I think the desire on the part of Russians to be part of the West makes them vulnerable to Washington's deceptions.
I've got another question here from Peter. This one is interesting. Dr. Roberts, you mentioned several possibilities, but why not going for the most probable one? For example, MH17 was shot down by rebels by mistake. Couldn't they possibly have anti-aircraft units capable of destroying airliner at 33,000 feet, supplied by Russians?
No, this is the least probable of all, because it's a known fact that the so-called separatists, whom Washington now calls terrorists,
of course they do.
The terrorist is as Washington and Kiev, I think. It's a known fact. They have no such weapon systems. These are extremely expensive weapon systems, and they have no expertise in using them. Indeed, one Russian general has said that he thinks the plane was shot down by the Ukrainians because they have not been trained in the use of this weapon system in 23 years since the Ukraine broke off from Russia. Mm-hmm. So they have the weapon system, but they haven't any training in. This Russian general says he thinks it happened because they didn't know how to use it and it launched accidentally. Now, this is a reasonable explanation. The trouble is, Norbert, that this Russian general's explanation of it as an accident does not explain why the missile system was in the area of combat.
Why they pulled it there? Yeah.
No, wait a minute. Because the separatists have no aircraft. So why would you have a missile system in a combat area when you're in combat with people who have no aircraft?
You've got a point.
So I think on the whole that unless it was some kind of an accident, that it was a plot by the CIA and these right-wing ultranationalists whose roots go back to the Third Reich. The heroes of these people are the Ukrainians that fought for Hitler against the Soviet Union. And we have seen in the many statements that they are Russophobic. They hate the Russians. They hate the Jews. And so it's easy for people like that to be used by the CIA. And so this could turn out to have been an American plot. I'm not saying it is. I don't think we can say anything until and unless there's an objective examination by experts of all the evidence and of the transponders. You see, these weapon systems, if I understand them, they can contact the transponder on an airplane. It's a safety device to be sure they're not locking on to the wrong aircraft, that they're not locking on to a civilian airline. And so if the transponder shows that it was contacted, that will tell us a lot. If the transponder shows it was not contacted, that also tells us that the contact was turned off because whoever was going to fire the missile didn't want to give any warning. And that could explain why the jet fighter or the jet fighter bomber went up to investigate the plane. But all of this is speculation. I want to say that this is all speculation.
Do you think will we ever learn the truth about this?
It depends. It's clear that the separatists and the Russian government have nothing to hide. The separatists have turned over the evidence to the Malaysians. The Russian government has released its satellite photos. It has released the flight path of the Ukrainian plane. It has called on Washington to release its satellite photos, and Washington is silent. The only evidence we have comes from Robert Perry, who says that a whistleblower contacted him and told him that the American photos do not support the American position, and that is the reason they're not released. Now, from my time in Washington, I can bet my life that there is tremendous pressure being put at this moment on the CIA analysts to change this story. Just as the pressure was put on the CIA analysts to change this story that Iran had no nuclear weapons program. You might remember when the United States was building the momentum for an attack on Iran, all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies came out with a report, the National Intelligence Estimate, that stated that Iran had not had a nuclear weapons program since 2003. And this infuriated the White House, and all kinds of pressure were put on the analysts to change their story, but they didn't. Now, that was, a number of years ago. Since then, we've had Bradley Manning, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and the analysts now will be easier to pressure because they'll be fearful. So we'll see what happens. But if tomorrow or the next day or the day after Washington comes out with doctored photos, we'll have to ask, why did it take so long? It didn't take the Russians long at all to release the photos. Why did it take Washington so long to release them?
Maybe it's difficult to doctor them. See.
There was a conflict, and they said, it doesn't support your argument. And they said, you make it support it. And they said, no, we won't. And they said, yes, you will. That's what I think is going on. And so in that sense, we'll never know. The Russians will show one thing, the faked Americans will show another, and everybody will say the Americans are real and the Russians are faked.
Well, now the time is in essence for us. I would like to move onto Gaza. There have been over 500 people killed in this conflict. Well, what do you think about this? This came up like last week as well. What's happening over there?
You know, because of Washington's protection, Israel can do whatever it wants. Now imagine if this was Slovakia or the Czechs or even the Russians
Yep.
doing this. The world would be screaming. The UN would be in session, all kinds of resolutions. There would be arrest warrants issued from the War Crimes Tribunal. The world's media would be demanding that heads roll in Czechoslovakia or Czech or Slovakia or Russia or wherever. But nothing happens. It's almost like the only thing that's happening is the young people are in the streets in London, Germany, Paris, South America, but not the media. The media doesn't care. The U.S. Senate just voted 100-0 in support of Israel's premeditated murder of civilians in Gaza. Now, this is premeditated murder. This is a capital crime. It is a war crime. And the U.S. Senate just voted 100-0. The House of Representatives had already voted in favor of the resolution supporting Israel's murder of Palestinians. There's been nothing. The United States didn't call up and said, stop this minute. We're cutting off all aid, all military aid, all protection. We're going to turn you over to the UN. We're going to let them vote however they want to vote. We're not going to veto it this time. Nothing. Not a word. Nothing. So the Israelis can do whatever they want because the American protect them.
I would like to ask you one thing. These people, I cannot even call them people, maybe psychopaths, God knows what they are, but their human life is nothing. It has no value for them. Even John Kerry...
Only theirs. Theirs.
John Kerry was caught, on live microphone saying sarcastically, that the Israeli assault was a hell of a pinpoint operation. He was talking about killing of hundreds of people.
You see, the Israelis say, this is to close tunnels that Hamas uses to send terrorists into Israel to slaughter our people. Well, of course, there aren't any tunnels. And there aren't any slaughters of Israeli people. And the rockets that Hamas fires off are acts of frustration. It's total frustration from the way the Israelis beat the Palestinians into the ground day after day after day. And the rockets have no effect. They're very primitive. I don't think any Israeli has been killed in the series of rockets attacks that Israel claims as an excuse. And if you're going to close down tunnels, why are you bombing hospitals? Why are you bombing civilian apartment blocks?
Hey, why are you killing, women and children?
Why? That's right. And why are you using illegal weapons? These explosive devices the Israelis are using, it's been proven, are illegal. They have those, I forget what the term is in there, but they slice through the air and just slice up everybody. It's like a dum-dum bullet on a mass scale. And they're illegal, and they're using them. And there are now reports that the Israelis are testing out new weapons on the Palestinian population. So I agree with you that this is an act of evil, and it's an act of disregard of life. But we can't just blame the Israelis, because nobody's doing anything about it. Nobody. The British Prime Minister hasn't raised his voice. Merkel in Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, what has she said? Nothing. What has Hollande said? Nothing. What has the Czech president said? Nothing. What has the Slovakian president? Nothing.
Oh, Slovakian president is hanging out from, Obama's behind, so don't worry about him.
So we can't blame the Israelis. The only people who are doing anything about it are the young people in the streets in London, Paris, in Germany, in Chile. And they're powerless. They can go into the streets. I mean, they're in Paris. They're in combat with the riot police. The tear gas is being used. Rocks are being thrown. But nobody else, no government is doing anything about it. Now you can say, oh, well, the whole world knows it doesn't do any good. If we bring a resolution, the Americans are just going to veto it.
Yep.
So why bother? But I don't agree with that. I think the more voices are raised, the harder it is for Israel to commit war crimes in the broad daylight in front of the whole world. What is the consequence of Israel being permitted to murder people in broad daylight and nobody raises a voice? No government? Why hasn't the EU issued arrest warrants for every member of the Israeli government? Every member of that government is a war criminal. It's not even debatable. Why aren't these arrest warrants issued? Why isn't there a war crimes tribunal formed right now demanding these people put on trial?
So what do you think? The world just now will let Israel to kill, all of the Palestinians, or half of them, and they just watch it in silence?
Look, and the Israelis are enjoying it. You've seen the videos where the Israelis take their beer and their snacks and their sofas, and they go up on top of the hill and they watch the bombing and they clap, cheer.
Oh, like those 6 in New Jersey, they were watching a 9/11. The stuff was happening, on the other side of the river.
That's quite different. They were sitting there to record it, which shows they free knowledge. I'm talking about Israeli citizens.
All right.
Are getting vicarious pleasure from watching the Israeli army murder women and children. They sit on top of the hill and they bring sofas, they bring their drinks, their food, and they sit and watch and they clap and cheer every time Palestinians are killed. So what kind of people wants the world to see them like that?
They don't even care.
That's the way they present themselves. They're God's chosen people. No one else counts.
I have a question here from a listener. Good evening, Mr. Roberts. This question I received from many of my friends is, what is your motivation for speaking with such information about the neocons and that the U.S. is involved in Ukraine, and what motivates you to provide this information to the public? I believe you, but really, what motivates you?
Well, the alternative to people being aware is going to be World War III, because the United States is determined to prevent the rise of Russia and China. How do you do that? If you can't demonize them and discredit them, then the only other alternative is war. And we know there's no prospect whatsoever of the United States defeating Russia and China in a conventional war. It could only be done through nuclear weapons. And therefore, what motivates me is to avoid the destruction of the earth and the genocide of all life on earth. That's what we face. It's exactly what the neoconservatives are driving toward. They have written papers, they have documents, they have doctrines that the United States can win nuclear war. These are explicitly stated. They're available. You can find them online. They're published in the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, in the Journal of Foreign Affairs. The neocon documents are available. This is not a secret. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. And so if the world doesn't understand that when they enable Washington the way Europe enables Washington to destroy countries in the Middle East, in Africa, Somalia, Afghanistan, to demonize Russia, to demonize China, they are encouraging this move toward nuclear war. And that is my motivation. I don't want to see the earth destroyed and all the life gone from it. Nobody can win a nuclear war. The neoconservatives believe nuclear wars can be won. But all the experts say, baloney, you get nuclear winter. You get a drop in temperatures. You get no food production for years. Anyone who's not destroyed by the blast and the radiation will starve to death. These facts. The world needs to be aware of this, and they need to understand that it's the United States that's driving toward this. Russia's not threatening people. China's not threatening people. The United States is building bases from the Philippines to Vietnam to encircle China. The United States has got the idiot countries in Eastern Europe, from Poland, including Czech, with anti-ballistic missile bases. The radar is going into Czech Republic. The missiles are in Poland. They intend to put more missiles in Ukraine. These are highly provocative, highly aggressive actions.
And unnecessary.
And they're unnecessary. And they reflect nothing but a selfish drive for hegemony over the world. The United States is the modern-day French Jacobins. They think that God has chosen them to impose their system on the world.
Well, my question is to the Polish, that what do they think, who's going to be hit first?
Right.
You know, just out of the blue. Now, the last question, and this is the guy is asking, his name is Marek, and he's asking that we are currently at the edge of global dollar dumping and explosion on derivatives. I would like to ask Dr. Roberts how he sees gold and silver in the next month and years, and also is there a possibility to turn situation and police state in the U.S. around?
I don't think they can turn the police state around. No, I think that the collapse of the United States has to come from outside forces.
Do you think that the American nation will have to bite the dust before they wake up?
Yes. Yes. And as for gold and silver, the Federal Reserve has been able to manipulate and suppress their price. And they're able to do this because there are two markets for gold and silver. One is the physical market, where people actually buy and take possession. But the price of gold and silver is not determined in that market. It's determined in the futures market, a paper market, such as COMEX in New York City, where people make bets on the price of gold and where the contracts are not settled by taking delivery of the metal, but are settled in cash. And in those markets, the Federal Reserve can step in, or it has the bullion banks, its agents, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, for example. These bullion banks go into these markets and they dump huge quantities of paper shorts. That is, they short sell the gold price. And this drives the price way down. It then triggers stop-loss orders, more selling. It triggers margin calls, more selling. And then the banks cover their shorts by buying it all back up at a price below the shorts that they put in the market. But in the meantime, they have knocked the gold price way down. Now, this is what the Fed has been using since 2011 to keep the gold price from rising and putting pressure on the value of the dollar. Because the Fed's policy of quantitative easing of creating $1 trillion new dollars a year or $500 billion or whatever amount it has been over the years. This makes the rest of the world that holds quantities of dollars look at the dollar and wonder what it's worth, and they start moving away from the dollar. And that then would cause a drop in the exchange value of the dollar. It would threaten the dollar's role as reserve currency. So the Federal Reserve uses the bullion banks to suppress the rise of the gold price by selling these naked shorts in the futures market. And so this makes it difficult for gold and silver to rise because the price is not determined in the physical market, but in the paper futures market.
Dr. Roberts, our time is up. Thank you very much for joining us today. And if you could stay on the line, I would like to say hi to you before we leave.
All right, Norbert, thank you for sharing your Eastern European audience with me. And I hope people pay attention and wake up and use whatever influence they can muster to cease enabling American hegemony over the world.
Thank you again, sir. You have a nice day. And we will continue with a short 4-minute passage from Dr. Ron Paul, what he has to say about the situation in Ukraine. Then we'll go to the break.
Hello, this is Ron Paul with your weekly update for Monday, July 21st. Just days after the tragic crash of a Malaysian Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine, Western politicians and media joined together to gain the maximum propaganda value from this disaster. It had to be Russia, it had to be Putin, they said. President Obama held a press conference to claim, even before an investigation, that it was pro-Russian rebels in the region who were responsible. His ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, did the same at the UN Security Council just one day after the crash. While Western media outlets rush to repeat government propaganda on the event, there are a few things they will not report. They will not report that the crisis in Ukraine started late last year when the EU and U.S. overthrew the elected Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Without a U.S.-sponsored regime change, it is unlikely that hundreds would have been killed in the unrest that followed, nor would the Malaysian Airlines crash have happened. The media has reported that the plane must have been shot down by Russian forces or Russian-backed separatists because the missile that reportedly brought down the plane was Russian-made. But they will not report that the Ukrainian government also uses the exact same Russian-made weapons. They will not report that the post-coup government in Kiev has, according to OSCE monitors, killed 250 people in the breakaway Lugansk region since June, including 20 killed as government forces bombed the city center the day after the plane crash. Most of these are civilians, and together they roughly equal the number killed in the plane crash. By contrast, Russia has killed no one in Ukraine, and the separatists have struck largely military, not civilian targets. They will not report that the U.S. has strongly backed the Ukrainian government in these attacks on civilians, which a State Department spokeswoman called measured and moderate. They will not report that neither Russia nor the separatists in eastern Ukraine have anything to gain but everything to lose by shooting down a passenger liner full of civilians. They will not report that the Ukrainian government has much to gain by pinning the attack on Russia, and that the Ukrainian Prime Minister has already expressed his pleasure that Russia is being blamed for the attack. They will not report that the missile that apparently shot down the plane was from a sophisticated surface-to-air missile system that requires a good deal of training that the separatists do not have. They will not report that the separatists in eastern Ukraine have inflicted considerable losses on the Ukrainian government in the week before the plane was down. They will not report how similar this is to last summer's U.S. claim that the Assad government in Syria had used poison gas against its civilians in Ghouta. Assad was also gaining the upper hand in his struggle with U.S.-backed rebels, and the U.S. claimed that the attack came from Syrian government positions. Then, U.S. claims led us to the brink of another war in the Middle East. At the last minute, public opposition forced Obama to back down, and we have learned since then that the U.S. claims about the gas attack were false. Of course, it is entirely possible that the Obama administration and the U.S. media has it right this time, and Russia or the separatists in eastern Ukraine either purposely or inadvertently shot down the aircraft. The real point is it's very difficult to get accurate information, so everybody engages in propaganda. At this point, it would be unwise to say the Russians did it, the Ukrainian government did it, or the rebels did it. Is it so hard to simply demand a real investigation? Thanks for calling this update. A new update is placed on this number, 888-322-1414, every Sunday. The written text can be found on my Ron Paul Institute website at www.ronpaulinstitute.org and on my Facebook page. Thanks for calling.